Good morning, and you're very welcome to today's Signpost webinar. My name is Mark Gibson. I'm the manager of the Teagasc Connected program. As we come to the end of yet another week of lockdown, we do hope that you're keeping safe and well wherever you are joining us from today. The Signpost webinar series is brought to you in association with the National Rural Network, Food Drink Ireland and Dairy Sustainability Ireland. To date, much of our discussion here on the Signpost series has focused on measures to reduce gaseous emissions from agriculture. So today we're going to take a look at a mitigation option that is arguably has huge potential to sequester carbon, and that is forestry. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Kevin Black, who is Director of Forest Environmental Research Services. Good morning to you, Kevin.
Morning, Mark.
And we're also joined by Tom Houlihan, who is Forestry Specialist with Teagasc. Good morning to you, Tom.
Morning, Mark and Pat.
And Pat Murphy, as you've quite rightly pointed out, Pat Murphy, good morning to you. Pat is our head of the Environment Knowledge Transfer Program in Teagasc. All well in Wexford this morning, Pat?
All good down here. A bit on the chilly side, but all good.
Very good. Kevin, you've disappeared from us there momentarily. If you could unmute yourself, Kevin, and we could maybe just get if you could introduce yourselves for us and tell us a little bit about the work that you do with your company.
Well, thank you, Mark. I've been involved in carbon research and forestry for over 20 years now, and I set up FIRS about 16 years ago, and we specialize in environmental aspects of forestry and particularly carbon. So I do work on the greenhouse gas inventory, policy support to the department and the European Union. I've worked on carbon tax schemes for forestry for national systems, carbon trading systems and things like that. And thanks again for inviting me to speak today.
Well, it's good to have you joining us today, Kevin. And Tom, could you tell us a bit about the work that you're doing in Teagasc? You're based in Kerry this morning.
That's right, and it's a kind of a dull morning here in Kerry, but we always live in optimism here in the kingdom. I work as a forestry specialist with Teagasc. So my work involves linking with research and advisory, and I suppose being a bridge between the two. Definitely working with and supporting my Teagasc forestry advisory colleagues, and also wider colleagues across the Teagasc organisation. And we would have also many external linkages and collaborations, which are very valuable. And also part of my role is to promote forestry in appropriate circumstances.
And today you're going to be talking to us about a new tool that's available for the sector. Could you give us an overview of that?
Yeah, it was launched by Minister of State Pippa Hackett in January. So it's called the Forest Carbon Tool. And again, I will explain a bit on the background in the presentation, but like we've collaborated with FIRS and it's developed with support from the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine to give indicative carbon figures for different forest scenarios, particularly if people are looking at establishing new forest.
And this is going to become really important, particularly in the context of potential increases in carbon, the price of carbon and sequestration, that farmers or forestry owners could use that carbon, or that there would be a value attached to it.
Yes, I think it's something that certainly will be looked at, and it has been raised as a possible option, looking at can there be a value in the carbon. But again, it's a policy decision that will need to be looked at, but certainly maybe it's timely to consider it as an option.
Very good. So you're going to give us a joint presentation today, and Tom, I think you're going to give us some introductory slides and then hand over to Kevin. So we'll ask you to share your screen with us, and really looking forward to your presentation. You're going to share a few screenshots as well of this new tool as well, I believe.
Yes, I'll come back hopefully towards the end and just have some maybe a short walk through the tool.
Brilliant.
Hopefully will be of benefit.
Super. Okay, we'll hand over to you. So Tom, you can share your screen with us now. So just while you're doing that, Tom, we just might remind people that today's webinar is being recorded, And if you do have questions for Tom or for Kevin, do use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen there, and we'd be delighted to go through any of your questions at the end. We have a huge amount of expertise in the room with us today, so please, I encourage you to take the opportunity to put your questions forward. So we'll hand over to you, Tom.
So is that visible now, Mark?
Yeah, that looks perfect.
Yeah, so just to kick off, the topics to include today are I'll give a brief introduction and look at forest mitigation pathways. Then I'll be handing over to Kevin, who will look at a number of areas around the forest carbon tool. Firstly, the afforestation scenarios, which are important up to mid-century, and specifically with the tool concepts, the assumptions, the background system boundaries and methods, validation, which is important, and also some results. I will come back in then, and as I say, look at using the forest carbon tool and a couple of take-home points. So that's the outline. To set the scene, and we are aware from many informative presentations in this series of major climate challenges, and future afforestation has a highly significant role to play. And a further important message is that climate change is not the only reason for sustainably expanding our forest resource, and in so doing, delivering benefits. So I think there's a clear and ongoing need for a balanced approach between sustainable wood production and realizing the social and environmental roles that are underpinned by sustainable management in new and existing forests. And I think another important point is that all forest types, be they conifer, broadleaf, and mixed forests, have an important role to play in contributing to the range of services that I outlined. While there are increased ambitions to plant more native forests and diverse species, productive conifers are and they will be required to meet a strong underlying demand for new homes and for other important future uses. And I think a recent UK Timber Trade Federation webinar has predicted tight timber demands in 2021, with predicted demand outstripping supply for some years to come. So achieving this balance is very important. And looking at forest level, carbon balances are based on net carbon emissions or removals from 5 forest carbon pools. And these pools are simply reservoirs of carbon. And we get fluxes, which are carbon transfers from one pool to another. So looking at these pools, we've got the above ground biomass pool, below ground biomass. We've got the litter pool, which is on we call the forest floor, soil carbon pool, and deadwood, which is an important component in the process as well. And carbon dioxide is taken out of the atmosphere and is sequestered. In other words, it's taken up by the trees during photosynthesis with a corresponding release of oxygen. And the rate of uptake is affected by many factors, as we might see. We also get long-term allocation of carbon into above and below ground forest biomass, and we get turnover of biomass into the soils and dead organic matter. So a lot of interchanges there. We can get a loss of carbon as a result of respiration by trees, both above and below ground, and decomposition or oxidation of soil organic matter. So they are complex processes. And if carbon uptake exceeds loss, the forest is a sink. And conversely, if the loss exceeds uptake, the forest could be a source. So the final output is the sum of these stock changes. And in the previous slide, we looked at the sequestration in the growing forest and the carbon pools involved. The long-term storage of carbon in harvested wood products represents a well-recognized and a very important pool outside of the forest. And we use the abbreviation HWP for harvested wood products, and optimizing long-lived products is important. Substitution of fossil fuels with wood energy from sustainably managed forests is a further carbon mitigation opportunity. And there are good examples around the country of significant fossil fuel displacement. So these are the 3 pathways included in the forest carbon tool, which we'll be looking at. And just to mention, a further area receiving much international attention, but not in the current system boundary, is the substitution of wood products for energy-intensive materials such as concrete and steel. And perhaps the ultimate example is called Mie Starnet in Norway, at over 85 meters, the world's largest or the tallest timber building. And a key factor is the use of engineered wood, such as glue laminated timber, and between 11 and 13,000 trees sourced from local Norwegian forests supplied most of the wood for this project. The total carbon dioxide equivalent avoided by using wood products over other materials in the building is more than 2,400 metric tons of carbon. So very significant. And just to, I suppose, mention the forest carbon tool, the focus of this webinar, it was launched in January, as I said, and it's available on the forestry section of the Teagasc website. It was developed in conjunction with the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, and with FAIRS for a number of important reasons, particularly to raise awareness of the importance of climate mitigation through afforestation, provide up-to-date information on carbon sequestration trends, allow comparisons of the relative merits of varying afforestation options from a carbon sequestration point of view. And I suppose just to say that this tool is for the purposes that I have outlined in the slide and not intended to provide absolute data on any particular forest carbon valuations or trading platforms at this stage. So I'll stop sharing now and hand you over to Kevin, who will take up from here.
Thank you, Tom. Now my video won't start, just hold on. Oh, the host has stopped it. Thank you very much, Tom. I'm just going to share my screen, and thank you for the very thorough introduction. So I'm just going to go through the concepts. Can everybody, you can see that screen, Tom? I'm just going to go through the concepts and the methodologies behind the forest carbon tool, and just talk about some of how we could interpret the results and looking at the different mitigation options and pathways. So I mean, just to set the scene, we speak about the importance of afforestation, but it's by far the largest land-based mitigation option in Ireland particularly. And it's the main contributor to reaching our 26 million ton target under the EU effort sharing agreement 2021 to 2030. Now, this is highly dependent on a number of factors, but the afforestation rate is a large driver on the extent of this sink. And you can see in the graphic shown below there on the effect of the projected forest sink going up to 2050 based on different afforestation rates. And as you can see, it's very important to have forestation rates exceeding the national target of 8,000 hectares to get a substantial forest sink. And at rates below 3,500 hectares per year, we're looking at nearly becoming a carbon neutral system in the future. So it's very important to sustain this, but there are other ways to do this, is to enhance your mitigation through afforestation using different options such as species, the productivity of species, the wood flow of carbon into the harvested wood product pool, as Tom outlined, avoiding deforestation, and of course, sustainable forest management. So that's just by way of introduction, but now I'm going to go into some of the concepts. And it's very important to remember that afforestation is a once-off mitigation option, okay? And it's not permanent unless the forests are managed sustainably. So once you afforest, you're nearly locked into continue afforesting, managing the forest in a sustainable way into the future. Otherwise, the carbon you save in this once-off step is lost, okay? And when we start looking at comparison of carbon sequestration options, they vary considerably over time and space. So we need to compare like with like, and this is a major challenge. But what we've done in the tool, we've used two concepts, which we talk about the cap value and the mean annual sequestration value. And just to demonstrate this, what we have in the two graphics is the cumulative carbon removals by the forest, the harvested wood product, the dead organic matter pool, which is the biomass, litter, and soils, and the product substitution into energy over time, over two rotations. And what you can see, the foresting slowly increases, the blue bars increase over time until you start harvesting, and then you lose carbon at that point. Some of the carbon is transferred to the other pools, and after the first rotation, you get this big loss in carbon, which builds up again. So essentially, that once-off carbon removal is what we call the cap, and it's the maximum potential of carbon that can be removed in the long term. That generally stays at steady state after 2 or 3 rotations. And we use this to make a comparison across different species. Just to add that the steady state in harvested wood product doesn't really occur because carbon keeps on getting transferred to harvested wood product in subsequent rotations, but the increase is very, very small. So the steady state assumption is quite safe to use. So we use this cap value to look at the once-off long-term sequestration value. You could look at it as the long-term potential, and then we look at the mean annual sequestration rate over time, and this gives you an idea on the speed at which a forest takes up carbon, okay? So generally speaking, what happens is as the rotation length of a forest increases, the cap value is higher, but generally speaking, the average annual sequestration rate is lower. So in the two examples here, we have a highly productive conifer, well, a productive conifer site, Sitka spruce, and you can see it's got a lower cap value, but it's got a higher average annual sequestration rate. In contrast, if you look at oak, it's much slower, but it has a higher cap value over time because of the longer rotations. The other very important concept to remember is the trade-off between how you store the carbon and the pathway that you choose for the mitigation options. The complex diagram just showing the transfers of carbons between the forest and the harvested wood product pools under two scenarios. On the left-hand side, we have a scenario where you retain most of your carbon in the forest system and have limited harvest. In that case, what happens is more carbon accumulates in the deadwood and the soil pools, and you get a higher stock and a longer retention in the forest system. In the other situation where you have perhaps a highly productive forest with a high inflow of carbon into the harvested wood product, you get a diversion into the harvested wood product, a higher decomposition loss from the forest itself. And so what that results is you have a lower carbon stock in the forest, but continued sequestration in the harvested wood product pool. So the important thing is that the forest is more resilient at storing carbon than other pathways. But in order to get a sustainable capture of carbon, harvested wood product also has a very important role. And you'll see the trade-offs when you start looking at some of the results. And just some quick assumptions, and I'm going to go through this quite quickly, but the assumptions are based on fixed management assumptions. So we have chosen a range of species, hill classes, and management regimes, and the results only apply to these assumptions. If you change it, the results, you can't use other assumptions and apply the results to that. That's a very important thing to do, to remember. There are some categories that we've done some work on that are still subject to high uncertainty, particularly the agroforestry and native woodland scheme. We lack the models, the really robust models to do this. You must also remember, and as I mentioned earlier, afforestation is assumed to be permanent under this scenario. So no deforestation is assumed to happen, and the same management is assumed to happen in perpetuity. We also assume that there's no leakage effect, and in the carbon world, the leakage is the displacement or intensification of activities leading to emissions elsewhere. For example, if you have livestock on your land and you replace reforested and you afforest it, and livestock management is intensified somewhere else, leading to emissions, we do not take this into account. So there are a range of species and GPC categories that we look at, but Tom will go into this a little bit further in his demonstration. Another thing to consider is the system boundaries, hence what we include and what we exclude. And as Tom mentioned, we include the forest carbon pools and mineral and organic soils, the harvested wood product pool, fossil fuel replacement from thinnings, and livestock emissions in the case of agroforestry. What we exclude from the system is fossil fuel emissions from forestry operations, emissions from fires, nitrous oxide emissions from mineralization of carbon loss from soils, and application of urea or nitrogenous compounds. These emissions are quite small, so it's quite safe to assume that they're negligible. There's also additional fossil fuel emissions from the milling sector during processing. And we exclude product substitution for energy intensive materials, but this is very important, as Tom mentioned earlier. We've also assumed that the biomass and soil stock changes under agroforestry under the non-woody componented agroforestry are zero. This is based on some assumptions from the literature. Just quickly to go into the models, and I know this is complex, but I mean, I'm just trying to give you an idea on how we do these estimates. And we use a modeling system called the carbon budget model. It's quite widely used across the world and also in voluntary carbon trading systems. We use it in the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. So we're using a well-recognized system that has been peer-reviewed and validated. And the model is based on timber volume increment curves from the industry standard systems like GROW4 or bespoke developed curves that we developed from research and the National Forest Inventory or other modeling systems. These growth models are then imported into the CBM model, where it converts growth into biomass components, and it then plugs it into this carbon transfer model based on the turnover, mortality of trees and disturbances such as harvesting and thinning. And this simulates the uptake and release of carbon from the forest system. We then, of course, also transfer the harvest from forest into the harvested wood product model and the bioenergy models that we use. And I'll touch on the validation of the models a little bit later. As I mentioned, the methods are fully in line with the IPCC guidelines, and it's currently used in the Greenhouse Gas Inventory. And they're subject to peer review and validation, and they're based on research. COFID has been really good at this since 2002. They've nearly continuously funded carbon-based forest research, and we have a depth of knowledge to build on here. There's some assumptions around the harvested wood product timber flows. We assume that the timber flows are the same as they are now. Obviously, these may change in the future, but generally speaking, sawlog is allocated to sawn wood. It's a semi-finished product. About 43% of sawlog goes into the finished sawn wood product, whereas pulp and pellet goes to wood-based products. About 49% of that does. And then, of course, the harvested wood products are also decomposed over time. As I mentioned, with regards to fossil fuel replacement, we assume that about 15% of the first and second thinnings go for, from spruce go for bioenergy, and all broadleaf thinnings besides sawlog are assumed to be used for bioenergy. And obviously GPC 12, which is the forest for fiber grant category, is used for energy. We use a substitution avoidance factor of 0.26 tons for every ton of carbon displacing a fossil fuel, assuming that we displacing oil. Just quickly, something about to look at the validation of the results. So what the graph shows is the outputs from CBM in terms of the net ecosystem exchange. So that's the net carbon balance per year for different forest types, whether it be Sitka spruce at different ages or ash at different ages, and we compare that to a method called eddy covariance, which is the only available real-time measurement of CO2 from the forest. This is a meteorological measurement, and we've had measurements in Ireland since 2001. We set this up in 2001. So we have ways of validating the model. This is very important. And as you can see, there's a very good agreement between the model influences, the model carbon fluxes from CBM and the eddy covariance estimates. So that gives us some confidence on the models. Another way to look at the validation is to look at the biomass of different forest types, and this is also from the COFID research program, and we compare it to the the CBM outputs, and you see a very good agreement there. Another validation we looked at, and some of you might be familiar with the Woodland Carbon Code, which have these curves for this a similar purpose, and it agrees very well for both conifers and broadleaf. So that gives us a lot of confidence that the models we developed are quite robust. Just very quickly, looking at the results, Tom will take this through you, but as you can see, the graph shows the two values that I speak about, the mean sequestration rate, the annual sequestration rate over time in the different pathways, either being the forest carbon pool, the harvested wood product pool, or the bioenergy pool. And then the black line represents the cap value, and if you remember, that is the maximum potential. And you can see there are some trade-offs here. You could get forests that sequester very high values of carbon. The annual value is very high. If you look at GPC 12, which is the forest for fiber scenario, it's got a very high value but a very low cap value. So there's a bit of a trade-off. Alternatively, when you look at your very slow sequestering forests like oak, it's got a low mean value but a very high cap value. So these are the trade-offs that we're looking at. So generally speaking, the average value will vary from 1 to 9 tons of CO2 per hectare. And the cap values could vary anything from 150 to 550 tons of carbon as a once-off long-term removal. So in summary, under the scenarios that we looked at, which represent most of the forest types that we're currently planting, the mean sequestration ranges from 1 to 9 tons of carbon per hectare. And this varies depending on species. Also, the cap will also vary depending on species. And a species with a higher cap value will generally have a longer carbon capture in the long term. Examples of these would be the native woodland scheme or the long rotation, slow growing broadleaf crops. Alternatively, in pathways where you have highly productive conifer species and a high carbon flow into the harvested wood product, you have a higher annual sequestration rate but a low cap value. Also, what we find, if you look at the thin versus no thin scenario, surprisingly, you see that no thin scenario appears to provide a higher sequestration potential than thin crops. This is because of the low retention of carbon in the harvested wood product pool that I mentioned a little bit earlier. And carbon's more resilient in the forest compared to harvested wood products. However, I should point out again, this trend might change the minute you start bringing in product substitution, because of the high sequestration potential of high value timber products into building material might change this trend. And I just want to highlight again on what Tom mentioned about the fact that forests have many ecosystem services and carbon is only a small component of the overall picture. Also to remember that afforestation offers a once-off removal. Although there is a continued decline from the harvested wood product, but we need to consider other forest policies to increase mitigation potential, such as forest management and product substitution. So that's all from me, and I'll hand over to Tom again, just to go through the tool.
Okay, just to finish off with a look at the use of the tool, and as I said, you can access the tool through the web address www.togris.ie/forest carbon tool. So it brings the user directly to the tool landing page.
We can't see your screen there in case you're sharing any screens or your video. Just
sorry. No.
We have shared the link to the forest carbon tool through the chat function there. So
okay. Is that visible now?
Yes, we can see that now. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. No. So the tool is available on all common web platforms, including the Internet Explorer, Google Chrome, Microsoft Edge, as well as on mobile devices. So it can be you get into the tool by clicking as indicated. Okay. So if you click as indicated here, that brings you in. The first page within the tool outlines some of the main assumptions as well as the background methodologies that Kevin has mentioned. And it's important, I suppose, to be familiar with these and also the capabilities of the tool as well as the scope for further improvements and enhancements. Under the methodologies and system boundaries section, there's a link to a document providing more detailed description for people who wish to read through on the working of the tool. And this assumptions page also contains the two tables that Kevin referred to, which people can review and looking at the grant and premium categories and the selected species groups that are covered in the tool. So once all the assumptions are read, the user can accept these assumptions and move on to the calculator page. And accepting the assumptions brings the user to this interface. So they can select either the current grant and premium categories or otherwise use more general species groups by clicking on the appropriate circle as indicated here. And here we have selected grant and premium categories. This brings up two drop downs. The first is the actual range of grant and premium categories that can be currently selected, and work is ongoing to derive data for GPCs 9 and 10, which will hopefully be uploaded in the next iteration of the tool and is just subject to further analysis and validation, which is important. In this example, shown in blue here, we've selected the GPC 8, which consists of high yield class alder birch category. The second selection required is the soil type from another drop-down menu on this page. And here we are selecting a mineral soil in blue. Having made these two selections, the GPC and the soil type, the next step is to hit the calculate button, which produces the carbon sequestration outputs. So for this GPC 8 option, we get estimated carbon dioxide equivalent removals relating to the forest site, the harvested wood products, and the fossil fuel substitution with wood energy as indicated in red. And these combined values provide the mean sequestration rate of 3.46 tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare per year over the two rotations of 75 years each. This mean figure is indicated as in the red line on the graph, and the graph also shows that the annual sequestration rates can vary over time during each rotation. And there are also emissions relating to forest thinning and final harvest before the forest carbon levels build up again in the second rotation. And the cap value, as Kevin referred to in this case, is the average cumulative sequestration is 471 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per hectare. So it represents an indication of the sequestration potential. If we compare the scenario for GPC 8 with a different grant and premium category, GPC 3, which contains an assumed 70% conifer such as spruce, it includes 15% broadleaves, and 15% of the overall area is set aside also for biodiversity enhancement, which includes open areas, environmental setbacks, hedgerows, and retained habitat. So we see in this GPC 3 scenario that the mean sequestration rate is higher, significantly higher at 6.82 tons of CO2 per hectare per year, while the cap value is lower, but still quite significant at 357. Just one other option that I would mention, given the time constraints, GPC 11, which incorporates the agroforestry option, which can include what we call silvo-pastoral systems. These combine widely spaced trees with the capacity for livestock grazing in between. And in this agroforestry scenario, the appropriate soil type is mineral, and the user has two additional drop-down selections, one for livestock type And here you can see the options available in the tool, which include sheep, young dairy cattle, dry stock age 1 to 2 years, and also a poultry option. And I have also indicated here the assumed emissions per head for each livestock type, and in parentheses, the range of units that may be selected for each livestock type. And the obvious references are also there. So in this example, we select agroforestry with sheep at a stocking of 12 head per hectare as the option. And again, we can hit the calculate button. And in this scenario, the mean annual sequestration by virtue of the forestry component is 2.86. So it's the sum of the three elements here. The agricultural emissions from the sheep is calculated at just over 2 tons of CO2 equivalent, which is deducted from the forest sequestration and giving a net mean sequestration of 0.83 tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare per year. The cap value in this scenario is also lower than in the previous two examples at 187 tons of CO2, again due to agricultural emissions. So in the absence of livestock, it would be up at around 340. And finally, just to note that the outputs from all scenarios that are run using either GPCs or species groups from the table 2 can be converted to a PDF using this button and either downloaded or printed off. So just to finish, we've discussed a range of areas this morning, and I will leave you with 3 final take-home messages. Firstly, that new planting can have a very significant role in addressing our need for climate change mitigation and moving towards achieving our challenging planting target is needed if we wish to achieve a strong carbon sink. A second point is that a range of forest types and approaches are necessary and can deliver a different range of ecosystem services, which will be dependent on owners' objectives as well as the forest type and management. So we encourage the use of the forest carbon tool as a support mechanism to inform, but partly inform at least decision making. And finally, I would reiterate that the future potential of substituting energy intensive materials, for example, concrete and steel, with sustainable wood products, and the benefits of building this into the future of our ambitions is very important. So I'll stop sharing that and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Kevin, for a really excellent presentation. And you took a deep dive there in a few of the areas. And I suppose we have a couple of questions coming in from our audience just around the whole difference between cap and sequestration rate. And maybe just could we just synopsize that for ourselves before we go any further, just to have it clear in our minds the difference there, and also is it a standard amount of rotations that are used when calculating the cap? So maybe Kevin, you'd like to take that one.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the cap is calculated when the forest reaches steady state. And generally speaking, after 2 or 3 rotations, you've hit the steady state, which means the forest won't sequester any more after that. So the cap value is calculated as the cumulative average. So the cumulative sum of the removals over the period is the cap value. And that represents the long-term storage potential, okay? So the other calculation we use is the average annual sequestration over the period. So that really gives you the idea of the speed at which the system accumulates carbon versus the maximum potential the system has to accumulate carbon. And the use of these values are very important because you can't compare oranges and apples. So you have to have some normalized value that you can, and we use these 2 metrics to do that.
So I suppose one thing that has become very clear is that it's not simple and it's not straightforward either in terms of, I suppose, particularly around that question around deciduous versus coniferous forestry. Would you care to comment on that? I know that in Europe, generally, I think there's a higher tree coverage in other European countries compared to Ireland. Is there a plan or a roadmap that you think we should be pursuing to get that right balance between deciduous and coniferous forestry?
Go ahead, Kevin. I suppose it's as I said earlier on, it's achieving a balance. And what I said is we need all these systems in place. We know that we'd say native woodland components and broadleaf components give us quite high biodiversity values, and they can give us a long-term hardwood resource. But also, as I pointed out, we're looking at a potential need in future years of up to 35,000 housing units per annum to build up to that. So I think we need all systems, and I don't see an either or. I see a strong need for both. That would be my strong view on it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Kevin?
Yeah, perhaps I could just add to it. I mean, the old termage that foresters always talk about is the right species for the right site. And I mean, that should be the overriding principle. This is only a decision tool. It's to assist you in making decisions. And I would agree 100% with Tom. A good mixture is what's required to fulfill all the needs and services that forestry provides.
And in many cases, Mark, engaging with forest owners, as my colleagues and myself would have been doing, we see that if you go around the country, that quite a lot of owners have actually mixed forests, or they have an area of conifer, which will give the economic return, but a lot of them have a big interest also in putting in some native woodland and having a nice mix even within individual forests, as well as at a broader level.
Kevin, from your perspective, you're aware of the level of planting that's happening in the country at the moment is generally low. How can this be improved, these rates, in your view?
Well, I suppose you could get incentive through policy. And I do notice that there's a tremendous interest from the public themselves now are prepared to invest in forestry just for the carbon capture, the biodiversity value. So the policy incentives are quite hard to drive because, as you know, they compete with other policies, particularly around land use. So it gets quite complicated. And also given that all the environmental constraints, it's very hard to hit these targets. So there are perhaps incentives that can be done, additional financial incentives perhaps for carbon could incentivize this, and other policy measures. I know under the EU strategy, climate change strategy, they have a pillar now with what they call carbon farming, and some kind of monetary system payment for this. So that's a good incentive. But it's very difficult to do against all the other land uses options that farmers have.
If I could just add to that, Mark, as well, I know a lot of viewers would be aware, like there is a licensing challenge there at the moment. So part of the needs and the urgent need is to have a continuous flow of licensing, whether it is afforestation, roading, or the felling to sustain our industry. So that is really critical, and it is being addressed by Project Woodland. So the expectation would be that that there will be a quick alleviation while still, I suppose, ensuring due process. And I also think that it's very important to support and maybe re-engage landowners, and just to show them that forestry can be a very complementary land use. And Teagasc would and other stakeholders would have very good case studies of owners who have come through the farm forestry enterprise and have had very good outcomes. And finally, just I would say integration of forestry with future agricultural schemes is very important. For example, in agri-environmental schemes where maybe an owner could have an option of transferring an area or a parcel of land over to forestry without any penalty. So integration, I think, is feedback we're getting as well that's needed.
Okay, thank you both for that. Pat, are you there? We have a lot of questions coming through here on the Q&A system.
Apologies, I left off my camera. Yeah, a lot of questions. A good number of questions relating to peatland, both in terms of I think current forestry on peatland and the net level of I suppose the balance of carbon from sequestration and potential losses there, and also I suppose the potential for a forestry solution on peatland that is being rehabilitated at the moment.
Tom, I don't know if you want to go first, but maybe I'll just answer the question with regards to carbon balance of peatlands. And I think everybody knows that drainage of a peatland results in emissions. And my personal view is that pristine peatland should be left alone and not afforested. Now, there are organic soils in the kind of continuum that are partially degraded or drained through the older arterial scheme, which are now degrading peatlands, which will still be a net emission. So although forests, an emission without forest. Now, when you afforest a drain organic soil, what happens, there's initially large emissions, but the total system starts being a sink after 10 to 15 years and remains so as long as you sustainably manage the forest until rotation, and then the process starts again. So it's not the perfect carbon sequestration scenario, but it is one that still offers sink potential. That's very important. But in saying that, I think in my personal view, it should be limited to very shallow organic soils, and let's learn from the lessons from the past and leave pristine peats as they are. That's my personal view.
Yeah, maybe just if I can, I suppose, add to that. And again, I maybe reflecting feedback that we get from the sector. And again, I think there's very genuine and strong views that, okay, we can exclude deep peats and pristine peats, sensitive sites, and those designated areas, annex type habitats. And I think if you look at the land types for afforestation, there's a different, I think 11 different types, land types described in that as unsuitable for forestry. But we do get feedback that there are sites that can be productive for tree growth and maybe merit consideration. And also feedback, we'll say, on GPC1 type sites where pioneer birch maybe is naturally recolonizing, and maybe with suitable incentive could be considered. But I think this is something that will also be on the agenda for Project Woodland and is an important item. And I suppose it's all tied into our land use strategy in the future, but it needs to be considered.
Okay, I think that's as clear an answer as I've ever got to that issue. So thanks for that. Questions there in relation to native woodland scheme and its inclusion in the forestry tool, or in the carbon tool, forest carbon tool.
Yeah, what I would say is that there's a couple of options within the tool. Again, we're looking at just further data analysis, and what, as Kevin said earlier, we try and validate as far as possible. So we would hope, and the idea with this tool is that if there is new or further information available, that we can incorporate it, and we'd be hopefully working with Kevin on that. And so maybe in the next iteration, we would have the GPC 9 and 10 categories, and maybe other. Let's also remember it goes up to yield class. We'll say if you're looking at spruce, it goes up to yield class 24, and the forestry colleagues out there will tell you that we can get yield classes up to over 30. And in the same way with broadleaves, it goes up to yield class 6 at the moment for the slower growing broadleaves. They can go higher, and also for the faster growing. So as more information comes available, we'd hope to have further enhancements built into the tool.
Yeah, and in relation to further enhancements, there's a couple of queries there around the, I suppose, the international, or the certification of the tool to international carbon accreditation standards, and then on top of that, then the possible movement or the possible role of the tool in carbon accounting when there may be credits given or income to be earned in relation to carbon.
Yeah, I'll take, I'm sure Tom will also respond. It's important to know that the tool only provides priori estimates of the carbon captured by forests. So the science is quite robust, and in fact the same approach is used for other international carbon trading schemes that actually use CBM. So it's not the science that's the limiting factor. The issue is the setup of the standard for carbon trading. There are a lot of other issues to consider, and I think I'm just going to highlight three for you. The first one is materiality, and this is what they refer to as the realness of your capture. So as a project that's registered for carbon trading, you have to show that you actually take in that amount. So every 10 or 5 years, you have to actively go to your forest, measure it, and prove that you've taken that amount. So that has to be included in the system. The second one is what they call offset title, and that's essentially undisputed proof of ownership. That's another thing that has to be proved. And there are a whole lot of other issues, like permanence has to be assured. So there's a buffer that needs to be applied. You have to show that there's no leakage, which I referred to earlier. So that relates to displacement of activities that leads to intensification or emissions somewhere else. You have to look at baselines. So the science is there. In summary, the science is there, but the system design and how it applies to the legal framework in Ireland needs to be developed to facilitate this. As I mentioned earlier, this is high on the agenda for the European Commission under their climate change strategy. They see the role of the voluntary carbon market very important to meeting climate change ambitions.
Kevin, could I just to follow on from that? I mean, what sort of infrastructure do you think is needed to realize that, particularly, you know, what are the critical elements that are needed to be put in place to realize this potential for carbon farming?
So the first thing to do is to set up the standard, and technically that's possible, and it's technically possible to look at other standards and develop the same. So what you need is a governing body that's preferably a non-for-profit, or there's no vested interest in it, and you need to link the carbon to a registry that makes it foolproof. And so it's like any system. If I'm selling you an engineering product and I'm saying it's a high spec, it's got an ISO spec to it. So essentially what you have to do is you have to put an ISO stamp on it that makes it real and verifiable. Otherwise, you sell in hot air. So you can't just say my forest sequesters X amount of carbon and try and ask for money. You have to prove that it does that, and it doesn't have any negative implications like environmental implications. This is why the licensing is so difficult. So because we have the licensing system that looks after the legal framework, that's all done for us. So we could piggyback on this and set the standard on the back of that. So I think it's doable. It's just a case of setting it up. And of course, addressing this issue of offset title, that has to be addressed.
And maybe just to add there, Mark, that within Teagasc, we're involved in, it's a forestry extension network, and we've had contact with Scottish Forestry, who administer the Woodland Carbon Code, and they started out in 2007 in the development of the Woodland Carbon Code, and it took a number of years to put in place, and like I think they're looking at further additional options now. So maybe it's timely to look at it, but I suppose there are issues to be addressed as well. And one of those would be proof of additionality. So it's beyond the normal, catering for like any forest planted is assumed to be permanent. Is there liability for reversals? And then, as Kevin said, there's monitoring and there's verification, validation. So there's a number of steps that need to be carefully looked at and considered in this process.
Sorry. Just come back there on the additionality. I'm sorry, just to make it clear what it means. It means you cannot claim that you capture carbon by doing nothing. So you have to do something additional to what you would have done anyway. And you have to prove that as a project. Otherwise, you're not getting real removal of CO2 from the atmosphere.
Could you give an example of that, Kevin?
So, for example, if you have an existing forest that you planted 5 years ago, you can't claim that as a carbon removal because it's been done already. So that's a very simple example. There are a whole lot of tools that you use. For example, financial additionality is one of them, or if there's any barriers. So for example, native woodlands are a perfect example. The financial return from timber flow from native woodlands would be quite small, but a carbon trading system would provide that financial additionality to make the project happen. And this is where carbon trading systems really come into play. You know, you can't have, even with the grant aid, it's very hard to convince somebody to do a native woodland if they're in it for money. So if you could plug ecosystem services into this, not just carbon, biodiversity, all the other elements into it and monetize it, that's a way of providing incentive for kind of back to nature forestry. So the additionality is around those concepts.
A question there, Mark, about the integration of management practices on an ongoing basis to get so that if you have optimal management, you get extra, if there is extra carbon sequestered, that you get credit for it. Is there a prospect of that being incorporated into a tool? And I suppose the second part of the question are, what are those practices in very briefly?
Mm-hmm. I think, Tom, if you could.
Yeah, okay. Like in terms of management, I suppose increasing forest growth and limiting disturbances, because as we've said, disturbances will cause carbon emission. Rapid establishment of trees and management, harvesting trees at the appropriate times and their appropriate ages. There would be one of the, I suppose some of them are from my perspective. And again, as I said, if we can incorporate further enhancements into the tool, we will certainly look at that. And maybe if people want to email with suggestions or thoughts on today's process, like we'll try and take things on board.
Maybe I could just add to that. I mean, with regards to management, we've done a lot of work on this. I mean, there's a whole range of options. Some of the options it's very difficult to estimate, like continuous cover. Everybody moots continuous cover, but in actual fact, there's no hard scientific evidence to support that it's better because we don't understand it and it's not commonly practiced. And also the idea that if you just leave the forest alone is a good option. It's not, because you've got this issue of forests getting older, extreme events, insect outbreaks, fires, wind throw. So it's a medium between the two. It's a mixture, but low intensity, most probably, and a mixture, or choosing the right species in the right type, having your high sequestration rates, high timber values. So it's a good mix again. I mean, that's a whole different topic, but I think it's something that maybe should be looked outside the context of this tool because it's very dynamic and it's very hard to give guidelines on it that could be used as this very simple guidelines. It's quite a complex topic.
We have maybe we just wrap things up on a final. It's probably a big question, but the question I have for you, Kevin, is the lack of a national land policy affecting the likely afforestation, some farmlands not suitable to plant owing to fragmentation and so forth. So in effect, the government not running this, but third parties. So I suppose the question really is, yeah, I mean, do we need a larger policy around this to try and drive, like what we're saying, even within forestry, you have climate change objectives, but you also have biodiversity objectives, which could, have very different management requirements.
Yeah, I see this, and I'd say some of the policies, the EU is pushing that already, as I mentioned, with the climate change strategy. So that will start changing things. But around the land use policy, I would agree that's what's required. But I would hesitate to only do a carbon one. And again, I think it has to be look at all options. One of the most interesting projects I ever worked on was a recent work for Board Namona, when they looked at their lands, and it was the first time we had this template of land to do a mixture of things on. Either it's re-wetting, carbon, energy, it's a mixture of everything, and to plan it at the landscape level. This is never done. We have these policies that relate to a farm level policy. We need landscape level policies. I would agree fully. I think that is what's required.
Okay, we're right out of time. Thank you both so much for your time and effort in your presentations. To Tom and to Kevin. Pat, thanks for helping with questions. Also, thanks to our production team, Andy Boland and Yvonne Maher. And a reminder that you can see a recording of today's webinar and all previous webinars on the Teagasc YouTube channel. And of course, the presentations as well will be available over the next coming days. So with that, thanks for watching, and we will see you again next Friday. We'll be joined by Lawrence Chalou and colleagues to discuss the reduced further reduction of mitigation options in agriculture. We're going to show you a list of the upcoming webinars here at the end of the show. So if you want to stay on, you can watch that through. Okay, thanks everybody, and we will talk to you next week. Goodbye.